Hello and welcome to another installment of the Criminology Chronicles. I am your host, Dr. Samantha Balemba, and I just had another really interesting conversation in my homicide seminar class, so I thought I would bring it to you guys because it's kind of an interesting question to think about when we think about juvenile homicide offenders. So this is essentially kids killing either adults or other kids, but kids as the perpetrator. So we were sort of talking about basically what do we do within the court system with offenders like this? Because we, of course, it's pretty well known, across the board at this point that, when we look at something like, for example, the psychological and neurological development of children, your brain isn't fully developed until you're age 25. So we know that. We know that kids think differently. We know that, when we were talking in our conversation today, we were talking about essentially, like, you look at some of the motivations for these crimes committed by children, and their motivations are not the same as adult motivations. Their motivations are things like, they're not doing things like looking for, a payout from a life insurance policy. It's not about an infidelity. It's not about, long-term kind of rage or revenge. It's almost like just stupid things sometimes. It's things like, a fight getting out of hand. It's things like, questioning my masculinity. It's things like fighting over a candy bar. Or we also talked about, the Slenderman case, which was the case where the two girls stabbed a classmate because Slenderman told them to, essentially, which of course is a fictional character. So, but when we think of this is how children's brains think. So the question then is, what do we do with these offenders? Because these are, not the Slenderman case that the victim actually survived, but it was certainly attempted homicide. But these are cases where the real lives are being taken. People are dead because of these crimes. So there is an effect, and there is something, there's going to be family that is affected. There's going to be people that want justice, that people that want retribution. And so we can't discount that. But we also have to think about the effects on the children as the offenders. And so thinking of how we can basically address that from a court system kind of perspective. And we can't. It doesn't seem like justice to take, a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, even a 15-year-old, and put them in prison for, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what the sentence is. And because by the time they reach adulthood, they already, for the most part, there are certainly some children that grow up to then be very violent adult offenders. But for the most part, they have changed by the time they mature into adults, even if that's happening within a prison context. So we looked at a couple of case studies of, we sort of compared some juvenile homicide offenders who were either tried as juveniles or tried as adults, and very different outcomes. And so, you had your case of where he was tried as a juvenile, and so then he's out by the time he's 21, and then he is, he's done all these things while he was incarcerated, and then is, out doing, whatever he's doing in the world now, and trying to be a better citizen or whatever because of the lessons that he's learned, and he's matured, and he said he understood now that he actually took the life of somebody else, and that person was somebody, he was somebody's brother, somebody's son, somebody's uncle, somebody's whatever. And so he understood that as an adult, and he did not understand that while he was still a child. And so we can see these differences. And so the question is, how do we treat these offenders? And certainly the juvenile justice system is very appropriate. It's something that we should be utilizing when we have these youthful offenders, because they are just not the same as adult offenders. And when we look at these cases, we have to keep that in mind, that these are not the same, it's not the same motivations, it's not the same, we can't use the same theoretical knowledge, the criminological theories that we have so many of. Some of them apply, but a lot of them don't. And because kids' brains are just different, kids are different. And kids are even different than they themselves will be later. And so it's just an interesting question about kind of what we do, because if you are coming from the side of the family of, whether it's an adult or a child who is killed by another child, if you are coming from that side, the victim side, you can understand that, oh, well, the focus shouldn't be on the well-being of this person who took my child's life or whatever. It's understandable that those people don't want that person to be treated, in any kind of hand-holding type of way, even though they are child offenders. But then coming from the other side, if you are the offender, or if it is, the offender is somebody who is close to you, then you're going to come from it being like, well, we need to treat this person as opposed to punish this person. So, and I mean, we think of like the case of like the Slenderman case where they tried to kill their classmate, and certainly it was horrific, but there were also mental health concerns in that situation. One of the girls was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that clearly played a role in that. And so the idea of mental health treatment is definitely something we should be considering as well. Because when we think of mental health treatment, that is something that if we have a child, even, anywhere, if we have kids as under 10 who are committing horrific acts and, up to 15, 16 before they're eventually into the adult system. But these are children who are committing these offenses. And so I don't know, it's just a tough question to have. And how many of those would be better off with mental health treatment? Because even a 13-year-old, let's say, who's committing an act of homicide, that is still very atypical for a 13-year-old. Most 13-year-olds are not out there committing homicide, obviously. So this means that probably mental health treatment is the more beneficial approach, because this is not a case of, these are evil kids. I mean, some of them there might be an argument for that, especially if we see what they do later on in their life. But for the most part, there is problems at home. There are mental health concerns. There are these other factors involved. And I mean, we can think about these, even if we think about cases like some of the school shootings, and these are children taking the lives of other children and faculty and whoever else is unfortunately victimized in these cases. And often we want to have we have that immediate gut reaction of, these kids are evil, we need to just punish them. And often they need treatment much more than they need punishment. And I mean, even if we think of something like there's this option of what's called EJJ, and it's extended juvenile jurisdiction. And what that means is that we could give a juvenile a lengthy sentence of, say, 20 plus years, whatever, but then essentially they serve the first bit within a juvenile justice system. Once they hit adulthood, whether that is considered 18 or 21, depending on the system, but once they hit that age range, let's say of 21, they are let out of prison. And then essentially they are under where you still have this sentence left. And as long as you stay, you don't commit any more violent crimes, then you can stay out. But essentially, if you commit another violent crime, you go back for the remainder of your sentence. It's almost like a probation type situation. But it's specifically for juveniles. So that's an option. And that's something that if that kid actually has more problems, then we need to address that. But what do we do then with the ones who have truly changed, and once they reach adulthood, they are not the same as that kid who committed that whatever the heinous crime was? And then this also begs the question of, if we are sentencing kids as adults, which some people support, and in certain cases sometimes it seems warranted, depending on where you're coming from and what happened and things like that. But even if we are sentencing juveniles as adults, where should we be housing them? Because that is another question of, should we be putting juveniles into adult prisons? And typically, I mean, all of the research says that that is a bad idea. This only essentially makes those youthful offenders worse. They are more likely to recidivate upon release. Depending, even if that release is way far down the road. Although aging out is another thing that can kind of happen, but that's a different discussion. But if we do want to try them in adult court, because maybe of the heinousness of the crime or the number of victims or whatever, then we should think about where we're housing them. And so if we want to try them as adults, that's one question. And then the second question is, if they are tried as adults, do we house them with adults? And so I think the answer to that should definitely be no. I don't know if you have a different opinion. And I mean, this is something you can definitely comment on my videos, but also like talk about it with people in your life and your circle. And it's an interesting topic of conversation is what do we do with these juvenile offenders? What do we try them as adults? And if we do we then house them in the adult system? I think housing them in the adult system is just not beneficial. It's a much better idea to house them in the juvenile system, even if that's just until they age out of the juvenile system and then they're transferred into adult prison. That's sort of a best case scenario if we have a juvenile that's tried as an adult and given an adult sentence. So these are just sort of some questions that we were going through, and I thought it was a really interesting discussion. And I had students on both sides, kind of some saying that, well, they're children, and so we need to treat them as children, but then some saying, well, but by 13 you should know better than to kill somebody. Most 13-year-olds know you're not supposed to kill somebody, and so it was like these kinds of questions, and it was really interesting. And I brought in the relevant statistics and things like that we were talking about, and the effects of the prevention initiatives and the effects of adult prison on juvenile inmates and things like that. And it was just a really interesting discussion. So I wanted to share it within the context of Criminology Chronicles, because it's one of those things that's really fun to kind of talk about. Fun. I might have a different version of fun than most people, but it's interesting to kind of consider these in abstract, but then also think about what would you actually want to see happen if this was somebody in your life, either the victim was somebody in your life or the offender is somebody in your life.